Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. Let's turn to the voting that is taking place today. 5 states having presidential primaries: Arizona, Florida, Illinois, Kansas, and Ohio. But with President Trump and President Biden now having locked up the nominations of their respective parties, much of the drama is now taking place down ballot. And Kate, there's a high focus on this Republican primary for the Senate in the state of Ohio. Can you give us a sense of what that story is?
Yes, Kyle. I mean, the short answer is it's an ugly brawl, a three-way race, and you have Bernie Moreno is leading the polls right now. He's a businessman. He's got Trump's endorsement, and Trump was in Ohio over the weekend to campaign for him. You have Matt Dolan, another candidate, Republican candidate, who is polling second, state senator, and he is endorsed by a popular Ohio governor, Mike DeWine. And then third, you have Frank LaRose, who is the Ohio Secretary of State, and he appears to be fading into the background. The other two candidates have a lot more money and firepower. And so what you've got a three-way race that's splitting up the electorate. And we're seeing kind of a classic replay in some ways of so many other primaries we've seen, where the Trump candidate can command 30% in a primary, but may struggle more in a general election. Now, the latest polling on the Ohio race suggests that Bernie Moreno is ahead, but I do think it is closer than it looks initially, because if you look at the Emerson poll that came out this week, you see there are a fair number of undecideds and that they're breaking for Dolan. And that makes sense. Dolan appears to me the more electable candidate. He's running ahead of Sherrod Brown in head-to-head polls. And the main thing about Dolan is he's not a fan of Trump's political style, has said so. He supports U.S. aid for Ukraine. So those are some of the defining characteristics that are breaking him up from Bernie Moreno. So I do think there is a possibility that Dolan could still pull it out in the primary. But I think the odds on are at this point for another case of excited Trump electorate producing their candidate in Moreno, but then having a pretty steep climb in the general election.
But notable also that Democrats know that, or seem to know that. And here is an ad from a group that is affiliated with Chuck Schumer trying to boost Bernie Moreno to the Republican nomination.
MAGA Republican Bernie Moreno is too conservative for Ohio. In Washington, Moreno would do Donald Trump's bidding. That's why Trump endorsed Moreno, calling him exactly the type of MAGA fighter that we need in the United States Senate. Moreno would lead the charge to enact Trump's MAGA agenda to repeal Obamacare and institute a national ban on abortion. Donald Trump needs Bernie Moreno. Ohio doesn't.
Kim, what do you make of this? This is a strategy that Democrats have pulled off, and often successfully, I must say, in recent elections that is disguised as an attack ad, but it seems clearly intended to get the message across to Ohio Republicans that Bernie Moreno is MAGA, MAGA, MAGA. I don't know how many more times they could have said that in the ad.
Yeah, I mean, this is now a straightforward campaign strategy on the left. It was something they dabbled in the past, and now it's a go-to, which I think is worrisome just because, let's be honest, it's pretty dirty politics. But you can go back, I think the first time they realized some of the merits of this strategy, 2012, the Claire McCaskill race. She was a Democratic senator up for re-election. And they put a lot of effort behind promoting a man named Todd Akin, who was very popular with the Republican base, but had made some very unpalatable comments on abortion when it came to many mainstream voters. Successfully got him named, and she beat him. If you go back just in 2022 alone, there an estimated $53 million was spent by Democrats on boosting Republican candidates in primaries to try to get them on the ballot because they were viewed as more easily beatable once they got there. So they're doing it again here in Ohio. Sherrod Brown, the incumbent, is weak this time around. Republicans have a very good opportunity to take him out. And so this is, instead of attempting to throw their money behind his record or promoting him, they're trying to tip the scale to make sure he ends up with the candidate with the most liabilities as possible in a general election.
The importance of this, though, is remember we have a Senate that is 51 Democrats and 49 Republicans. And there are 3 Senate races where there are Democratic incumbents in states that were won by President Trump. One of them is West Virginia, where Joe Manchin is retiring. That is rated as a solid Republican pickup. And so if we assume that nothing else changes, we're to a 50-50 Senate, which would be controlled if President Biden wins re-election by the tie-breaking vote again of Vice President Kamala Harris. The Senate will swing on these other seats, 3 toss-ups, one in Arizona, one in Montana, and one in Ohio. And 2 of those, again, were states that President Trump won. And so, Kate, if Republicans can't win that Senate seat in Ohio, it starts to look like a bigger climb to take back control of the Senate, which could either mean trying to help get through President Trump's agenda or trying to block President Biden's agenda in a second term.
It does become an uphill climb. I mean, in Montana, the Trumpy candidate, Matt Rosendale, didn't last long in the race. And I think Tim Sheehy is clearly the stronger candidate. So I do think Republicans have an opportunity there to defeat John Tester. But Arizona, facing the choice between Kari Lake, who lost her gubernatorial bid and has been very closely aligned with Trump, and Ruben Gallego, who is a true progressive, supports Medicare for all, single-payer healthcare. That is going to be a tough climb for Republicans in Arizona. And so you're right. We get back to Ohio, where Republicans need to pick up this seat. And I'd add, so we had in 2022 another contested primary in Ohio that J.D. Vance won with about a third of the vote. And so it looks like it could be a replay of that. But I would add, J.D. Vance needed support from Mitch McConnell toward the end of his campaign to get him over the finish line. And he was running for an open seat vacated by Rob Portman. Taking out a Democratic incumbent is a much tougher slog. And so I do think Sherrod Brown is so vulnerable, and yet it could be that Republicans whiff here if they nominate Moreno again, and if his liabilities turn out to be larger than Republicans understand now.
One final thought here. One reason that Republicans might be interested in focusing on the electability of these Republican Senate candidates is that the stakes are pretty high. There has been a push in the past few years for Democrats to get rid of the legislative filibuster so that one party can pass anything that it wants in the Senate, anything and everything. And there were 2 Democrats who explicitly said no to that. One was Joe Manchin, previously mentioned, retiring. The other was Arizona Senator Kyrsten Sinema, who announced earlier this month that she is also retiring. And the Democratic presumptive nominee in that seat, Kim Ruben Gallego, called several years ago for, quote, filibuster reform, unquote, which is a great euphemism if I've ever heard one. And so it seems if Democrats do retain the Senate under President Biden, it is not clear that there is another Democratic vote to not destroy the filibuster. And so if Republicans see those stakes as that high, maybe there's a reason that they might want to focus on Republican candidates who can beat Ruben Gallego or who can beat Sherrod Brown.
And let's just think about what it means if you get rid of the legislative filibuster, okay? Because it puts yet other things at enormous risk. And I would mention, for instance, the Supreme Court, in that just about every Senate Democrat is now on record saying that they would like to alter the size or the structure of the court to do anything necessary in order to get rid of what is now a conservative majority. And so I would put both of those things one after another as what is in stake with these races. And we also know very clearly from very recent history what happens when you do end up in these primaries nominating candidates that have liabilities and that aren't as attractive to voters in the general election. Look at Herschel Walker in Georgia. Look at Blake Masters in Arizona. Look at Mehmet Oz in Pennsylvania. Those were all races that, in theory, given Joe Biden's very low popularity numbers in the last midterms, Republicans should have got and ought to be in control of the Senate right now and consider what might be being done in terms of promoting their agenda if they had pulled that off. They lost that opportunity. But again, as you note, Kyle, this time it won't just be the further loss of the ability to govern, but potentially the loss of a longtime tool that provides a bit of stability against Democratic progressivism.
Thank you, Kim, Kate, and Alicia. And thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.